welcome to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton. And it was going to be the Weekend Interview Show, but it looks like we're not going to get a hold of our first guest. We're going to talk with Jim Rogers, the adventure capitalist, but can't seem to get a hold of him. Maybe he forgot. Maybe I'll try to email him during the break or something, see if we can figure something out there. But anyway, that's okay because there's so much news to talk about. We have no shortage of that. And also at 4:30, second half of the second hour, I'll be talking with Lawrence M. Vance again. You might remember him from a few weeks ago, author of the book Christianity and War. And he will be back and to talk about his new article about the fair tax, quote unquote, the new proposed national sales tax, the bills of which are before the House and the Senate. Hopefully there's not too much traction behind them. It doesn't seem like there are, but as much as I can help to discredit the idea before it even begins to get traction, then that's the better off we will be, I believe. So anyway, that'll be Lawrence Vance in an hour and a half from now. Until then, you're stuck with me and the news, but that's okay. I got plenty of it. I'm looking at the front page of antiwar.com today, and there's nothing but bad news. And, in fact, we might as well just start with top brass implicated in Bagram scandal. This is about the murder of 2 detainees at a U.S. prison in Afghanistan, and how the senior Army intelligence officers who were in charge there were redeployed to Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq in 2003, quote, while still under investigation for the deaths of 2 detainees months earlier. And, quote, The Guardian, the Bagram case also suggests that some of the prison guards were given little, if any, training in handling detainees and were influenced by a White House directive that, quote, terrorist suspects did not deserve the rights given to prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. And, of course, if you were to just simply Google the word copper green and maybe study the Wikipedia entry, read some Seymour Hersh articles in the New Yorker, you'll find out that that's really the source of Abu Ghraib is not a couple of degenerate Appalachian folk working the night shift with no supervision, but that actually they took their quote-unquote legal decisions or findings about how the Geneva Convention does not apply to al-Qaeda or Taliban suspects in Afghanistan, and then they used those same tactics, of course, at Camp X-Ray at Guantanamo Bay, and then when the insurgency in Iraq began to get out of control in the fall, really out of control in the fall of 2003, they Gitmo-ized the prison standards in Iraq. And they brought General Miller from Guantanamo Bay and they put him in charge in Iraq. And that's when all the real torture started. And all the low-level people, it's been nothing but low-level people court-martialed for the Abu Ghraib abuses. But they have said that they thought that they were doing what Army intelligence wanted them to do. And it's interesting that the actual truth about the chain of command, I mean, Seymour Hersh wrote a whole book about it called Chain of Command that explains exactly in great detail how George Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, Alberto Gonzales, the Attorney General of the United States right now, how these guys were the ones with General Myers and with William Boykin at the Pentagon, and with Douglas Feith as well, that these guys set up this special access program called Copper Green to torture the truth out of them. And that's the source of the Abu Ghraib scandal. And as more and more news breaks, you'll continue to see absolutely nothing done about it. I'm Scott. This is the Weekend Interview Show. We'll be right back.
Don't take your guns to town, son. Leave your guns at home, Bill. Don't take your guns to town.
My friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton, and I did succeed in getting Jim Rogers on the phone here. He's the adventure capitalist. He's the author of the books Investment Biker, Around the World with Jim Rogers, Adventure Capitalist, The Ultimate Investor Road Trip, and Hot Commodities, how anyone, I'm sorry, I wrote too small here, how anyone can invest profitably in the world's best market. Welcome to the show, sir.
Scott, I'm delighted to be here.
Well, thank you for joining me. I read this great article that you wrote on LouRockwell.com about the rise of red capitalism. That's mostly what I want to ask you about. But I think first, maybe you can just give us a little bit of the background about how you became the adventure capitalist.
Well, that's a good question. I always had a dream to go around the world on a motorcycle, and I did that in 1990, 91, and 92. And I wrote a book about that called Investment Biker, by going around the world on a motorcycle, but it just whetted my appetite. I wanted to do it again and see more, so I set out at the turn of the millennium to do 3 years around the world, this time in a special car, and so we named that book Adventure Capitalist. So I am the investment biker and the adventure capitalist, if you look at it that way.
So as you're going on these adventures all around the world, you're finding good places to make money at the same time.
Well, by the nature of who I am, Scott, my background is such that, I've been an investor for many years, and so if I see something good happening, I don't just wave at it and keep going. I stop and make an investment.
I get the idea from reading your articles that what seems like might be a good investment to you, it tends to be different than most people at any given time. Is that right? Well,
I've certainly found out over my career that the way to be successful is not to invest in what everybody else is investing in. If everybody's investing in it, who's left to buy it after you do? So I usually find things, or at least my method is that I find things that are very cheap, that are, by definition, they usually ignore it if they're very cheap, where I think I see a positive change taking place, and then I invest. But you don't get rich buying things that everybody else is investing in. I think the world has learned that many times.
Right. Or maybe it's the right thing as long as you get out before everybody else does, right?
Well, okay, sure. People who jump on a moving bus and they get off before the bus stops, but, you might also break your leg.
That's a good point.
It's always better to get on the bus when it's sitting in the station and there's plenty of room and there are plenty of seats available.
Okay, I accept that analogy, I guess. So the rise of red capitalism. What exactly is red capitalism? That means the new emerging markets in Red China?
That was taken out of that's another book, a recent book I did. It's called Hot Commodities, and they excerpt it. It's about the rise of China. The Chinese call themselves communists, Scott, but they're among the best capitalists in the world right now. In fact, I know people who tell you that they are the best capitalists in the world right now. In China, they save and invest over 35% of their income. We in the U.S. save and invest less than 2% of our income. In China, when people come to work, they don't ask how many days vacation they get. They ask how many days they can come to work, because everybody's trying to get rich and get ahead. Quite the contrary, what's going on here and in many other Western countries, as you well know.
It is a very entrepreneurial culture, isn't it?
Well, it has been for a few thousand years. They've had some fantastically successful periods. They've also had some disasters, as you know. One of the disasters was after the communist, actually the 1900s and the 1800s and even into the 1900s was pretty much a disaster. The old regime collapsed. The communists took control, and they made it even worse. But I think now that they've unleashed capitalism again, they're on the rise.
And it's interesting because there's really a big debate, I think, in America about, after all, if they're not really Marxist anymore, the government there is still run by a Politburo, and it is still a very totalitarian society, is it not?
Well, you read the American press a little too much, I think. Come with me next time I drive across China. You will see that there are many, many, many periodicals springing up. If you go to the churches and the mosques and the temples, they're all packed. Yes, there's certainly persecution, and the government, any government always cracks down sometimes on people when they shouldn't. But for the most part, it is loosening up. It is not tightening up because the people have all tasted the outside world. Many of them travel now. They've all seen Western TV. It's hard to put the genie back in the bottle once people start opening up, as you well know.
So basically, the more rich people you have, the more people you have who will not tolerate being pushed around. Poor people can be pushed around, but rich people can't, basically.
Well, I'm not quite sure I'd put it that way. That's not what history shows. What history shows is that when you arouse people's expectations, that's when you cannot suppress them anymore. Because if you dash aroused expectations, you get overthrown. So it's not so much rich people as arousing expectations. And in China now, everybody has come to believe that A, they will be successful, B, they will be able to practice religion. If they won't, they'll be able to protest. If you go to China now, you see protests. They're protesting landlords, for instance. They're protesting real estate shysters. I mean, and 20 years ago, they didn't protest anything, as you well know. So it's really not so much rich people as just the exposure to the outside world. Plato, as you may remember when he wrote The Republic, he said that the way societies evolve is they go from dictatorship to oligarchy to democracy to chaos and then back to dictatorship. I don't know if the Chinese have read Plato. Suspect they have not. But many Asians will tell you that the Asian way is to improve prosperity. From that comes democracy, etc. South Korea certainly showed that. Foremost, a few places have demonstrated that theory. And the Asian way is pretty much what Plato wrote about, only he didn't call it that. So, I mean, I don't know. It seems to be evolving that way. We will all find out.
A friend of mine does, or actually I guess he used to do business in China sometimes, and he told me that in 10 years between visits to Shanghai, he absolutely could not believe that the size of the city increased by 100 times or something. He said it was like 10 downtown Houstons all smashed together.
Well, it wasn't quite 100 times the total size of the city, but certainly the magnitude and the grandeur of the city increased 100 times, if not more, because 20 years ago, Shanghai was essentially a moribund communist. It wasn't even a trading post. Now it's one of the great cities of the world. I'm thinking about moving there. It's certainly the most exciting city in the world that I know of. It'd be like moving to New York in like moving to New York in 1905 or London in 1805. It is really dramatic what's happening there.
So they're really just right at the beginning of that tipping point. They're just getting started. Their economy is where ours was 100 years ago.
If you ask me, yes. That's why I'm thinking about moving there. I have a 23-month-old daughter, Scott. I'm teaching her Chinese. She's already bilingual, as a matter of fact, because in her lifetime, the most important language will be Chinese.
That's
well,
great.
English and Chinese, but certainly Chinese.
Well, and it's often put in terms, I think, in the media about whether we can compete with them. And I don't know whether, for me, I don't really like the terms because I tend to think of everybody just as individuals rather than as part of our nation-state collectives. So I wonder, is it necessary that America, quote-unquote, competes with China, or are we not just all free people trading and trying to get rich?
Well, that's really what it's evolved to. Maybe once upon a time, people would have thought in terms of the nation-states competing, but now more and more it's individuals, it's companies even that are competing. And competition has historically been good for people because we all want to buy from the cheapest and the best source. That's what competition's all about. That's good for anybody. That's good for a consumer. That's good for a company. That's good for a nation. So, yes, competition is great. I don't use competition pejoratively. I use it positively.
Well, there are a lot of people who, particularly, I suppose, on the right, but on the left as well, who are very protectionist. And in fact, George Bush put tariffs on Chinese steel for a time. And people are very worried that, quote, unquote, we're losing our jobs. And those Chinese are going to take our whole economy away from us if we don't use our government to protect us from them.
Well, again, history has proven that nobody wins a trade war. Everybody loses a trade war. Bush didn't put restrictions just on Chinese steel. He put restrictions on all steel, which was pretty outrageous. It just made the price of steel go up for all of us, no matter what we buy. There are 270 million Americans. We all buy something that's made of steel. Maybe there are 500,000 people who benefit from tariffs on steel. Well, do the arithmetic, Scott. 270 million people suffered to buy a few votes from 500,000 at the most. So protectionism has never been good for anybody, and I don't care whether you're the right or the left or anything else. The facts have proven it over and over again. The protectionism, nobody wins trade wars. Nobody wins trade wars, ever. No, because the people who think they benefit, and again, it's usually small minorities. What happens, and again, it's just history, Scott. When you have somebody, some industry or some group starting to be troubled by other competition because other people can do it better, they start screaming and yelling and going out into the streets and getting attention. You don't see the people who are benefiting from free trade and open trade because they're all making too much money and working too hard. You never heard anybody going out into the government and demonstrating because they're being successful. It's only people who are losing out, and that's why you have protectionism, but it doesn't, again, nobody's ever benefited from protectionism except very, very small minorities. And they only benefit for a limited period of time because ultimately it backfires.
All right, my friends, I'm Scott Horton, and this is the Weekend Interview Show. I'm talking with Jim Rogers. He's the investment biker and the adventure capitalist. Those are titles of two of his books. His website is jimrogers.com. This guy retired at 37. So if you guys have some money and you want some good advice about maybe where to put it in order to keep it safe, you might want to start paying attention to Jim Rogers. We will be right back after this break, so stay tuned. All right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Jim Rogers. He's the author of Investment Biker and Adventure Capitalist. His website is jimrogers.com. And we're talking mostly about China and its emergence as the major world power. And I guess in the substance of your article here, The Rise of Red Capitalism, which was featured on LouRockwell.com last week and is easily searchable, The Rise of Red Capitalism by Jim Rogers, you're really talking here about the Chinese, let me pronounce it right, the renminbi, and how it is pegged to the U.S. dollar, and apparently it's been quite inflated, and the American politicians want them to let the currency float. What's going on there?
Well, yes. I guess, again, it's another one of these ironies. You really can't trust politicians because, A, they don't have any memory, and B, they don't have any brains. But back in the early 90s, 1994 to be precise, China's currency got into trouble, so they pegged it, they tied it to the U.S. dollar. In other words, they said that it will always be the same value to the U.S. dollar, which the United States government applauded and almost forced them to do it. Said this is the best way to do things. Now, of course, cut to 10, 11 years later, now the U.S. government is blaming that on China's success. They're saying, gosh, if your currency weren't tied to the U.S. dollar, it would be more expensive and you would not be as competitive. So they're talking once again out of both sides of their face. But that is something that the politicians say, that if the renminbi were freely convertible and were not tied to the U.S. dollar, it would go up, which would make Chinese products more expensive and therefore American products more competitive.
Which is true, right?
It would certainly probably go up, at least it would eventually, and it would make American products seemingly more competitive, at least for a while. The problem, Scott, is that no country throughout history has ever succeeded by selling on price. You sell on quality. You sell on deliverability. You sell on goods. Think of all the shoddy goods you bought in your life that you never went back and bought again. So trying to sell on price is not going to save America. We became the greatest country in the world because we had the best quality, the best goods, the fastest service. We really knew what we were doing. Now we're becoming sort of second or third world. The world is trying to cut our rates.
But it is kind of both, isn't it? I mean, I'm not going to sit here and pretend to argue for protection because I probably couldn't make a convincing argument as a devil's advocate. But the thing is, Americans demand, unions aside, we demand reasonable wages for hard work. And apparently American labor just cannot compete with the price of labor in these emerging economies. And so isn't it really a problem if we're moving our entire industrial base overseas? I mean, you're right about the quality matters, but the price matters too.
Well, of course it does, and many countries have tried protectionism to save themselves, but I don't think you can name a single country in history that has ever succeeded using protectionism. It works for the short term, but if you can name a country, Scott, you're the only person in the world who can name a country that succeeded in the medium term or the long term. Sure, people deserve high wages. On the other hand, if other people are willing to work for less, what are we supposed to do? Say, hey, you guys are willing to work for less? There's something wrong with you?
Well, I agree with you that I would never ask the government to initiate force on that subject. However, the question is, does that mean that the American working person is going to have to lower their standard of living to that of the average worker in China in order to keep their jobs?
Well, that's not the way things have worked. Let's look within the United States. As you may remember, the shoe industry used to be in Liverpool. Well, it used to be in England. It used to be in Liverpool. That's where shoes were manufactured for most of the world. Then in Massachusetts, they said, hey, we can do it better and cheaper. So the shoe industry moved to Massachusetts and New England. Was that a bad thing for the world? I would submit that it wasn't, because then the world got better and cheaper shoes. But then South Carolina and Georgia said, wait a minute, we can do it cheaper than you can do it in Massachusetts. And so the shoe industry moved within the United States to South Carolina and Georgia. Was that a bad thing for the world? I would submit it wasn't. Maybe the people in Massachusetts didn't like losing the shoe industry, but nobody forced them to work and have outrageous prices. And if people wanted to buy shoes from Massachusetts, they could have. But this is a free country, Scott. If people wanted to buy cheaper shoes, are you going to tell them they can't?
That's interesting. That's an example that I've heard about the firm believers in the state about how when the Soviet Union collapsed, people were worried that where are they going to get their shoes, because the central government had provided their shoes, I guess their yearly shoe allotment or whatever it was, and they just couldn't imagine that free people acting in their own interest would be able to get them shoes for their feet. And they were just amazed to find out that it actually worked.
As you probably know there, you have your choice of thousands of pairs of shoes now in the former Soviet Union, whereas before you were lucky to get a new pair of shoes every year or two. You had to stand in long, long lines, and you just couldn't get them. And if you could get them, they were shoddy.
Right, they're probably all brown and uncomfortable.
And there were very few shoe stores. There were hardly any. In the former Soviet Union, people walked around with knapsacks all the time just in case they found something in a store so they could buy it, whether they need it or not.
All right, very interesting discussion with Jim Rogers. His website is jimrogers.com. He's the investment biker. Stay tuned. My friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton. The website is weekendinterviewshow.com. I keep all the archives there in MP3 format for you to download. And my email is scott@weekendinterviewshow.com or scott@antiwar.com. I write for them. In fact, I'll have a new article up Monday, so check that out. I'm talking with Jim Rogers. His website is jimrogers.com. He's the author of the books Investment Biker, Adventure Capitalist, and Hot Commodities. And speaking of hot commodities, in researching some of your past articles, sir, it seems like you really don't want people to invest in companies, but directly in goods that companies might be exchanging. Am I right?
Well, Scott, yes, at the moment we're in a bull market for commodities, for hard assets, for real things. We were in a great bull market for stocks and bonds in the 80s and 90s, but in my view, that's finished. I mean, if you find the right stock, sure, you'll make a lot of money. So I'm not against investing in stocks. It's just that the better opportunities at the moment are in real assets, natural resources. Well, mainly because in the 80s and 90s, while everybody was running around buying stocks and bonds, nobody was investing in productive capacity. Nobody calls you up, Scott, in the 90s with a sure investment in a sugar plantation or a lead mine, and so mines deplete. We haven't had a major oil discovery anywhere in the world in over 35 years. Well, the Alaskan oil fields are in decline now. They're depleting. The Mexican fields are depleting. The North Sea is in decline. The UK, which has been one of the world's great oil exporters for 25 years, will be importing oil within the decade. So, it's just that nobody invested in looking for new capacity or building new capacity. Now it's running out. Demand has grown. You know what's happened in Asia. America's grown. Europe has grown. So with supply down and demand up, that's called a bull market.
Yeah, there you go. In fact, I saw an article where you had predicted $50 a barrel oil, I guess, more than 2 years ago, right?
Oh, yeah, some time ago. And now, of course, it's going higher than 50. It's not over, Scott. The price of oil, the surprise is going to be how high it stays and how high it goes ultimately.
Well, that's great if you're a billionaire who owns a lot of oil commodity shares and such. But for the rest of us, it's this is really bad for the rest of the economy, isn't it? I mean...
Well, not necessarily. If you're producing oil, if you live in Oklahoma or Texas or Colorado or some of the states that produce energy, all the coal miners are going to be in hog heaven. A lot of people are going to be doing very well. The corn farmers are going to do well because people are going to be converting corn into ethanol because ethanol is cheaper than gasoline. People in Canada are going to be doing extremely well because they have a lot of natural resources. So some people will be benefiting. People who don't see it coming and don't prepare for it are going to suffer. But those are the cruel facts of life, Scott. Some people always benefit when there's a change, and some suffer.
Well, the
trick is to be on the side that benefits.
Right. Yeah. Keep your eyes open so you know what's coming. Right.
Exactly.
So, I think the natural balance of things, I suppose, would be if oil continues to have such a high price, then that's going to convince more people to invest in new production so that they can sell brand new oil at that high price, and that eventually all that new production is going to drive the price back down to some sort of balance. How long do you expect that kind of cycle to take place?
Well, Scott, you just said it better than I could have, because that's what's always happened in history.
Did you hear that, guys? This guy's rich, too, really rich.
Well, when something goes up in price, it does bring in new supply. That's happened for a few thousand years. The average cycle has been about 18 years for bull markets in commodities, and likewise the bear markets in commodities. You hit the nail on the head. Prices went up 10 times for oil. In the 70s, we all cut back. We bought smaller cars. We didn't heat our houses so much. We didn't cool them so much in the summer. So then a lot of oil was discovered, and the price of oil went down by about 80%, 75 or 80%. So, and then, of course, for 25 years, since we had cheap oil, nobody invested in oil, and now we're running out again.
Right.
It will take a while and a much higher price.
Are people so short-sighted?
If prices go to $150 for oil, they're about $50 now. If prices go to $150, Hillary Clinton will not be speculating in cattle futures. She'll be speculating in oil. They'll be drilling for oil on the White House lawn if that happens.
Wouldn't the statists and the Keynesian types say that this is what you described as the perfect example of free markets really not getting the job done, because people are so short-sighted that we have these terrible booms and busts, and we can't just keep some sort of even keel on production without state power mandating it.
Quite the contrary. It's the case of the free market working, because when the shortage is developed, the free market brings them on stream. Do you think the government's going to bring you oil on stream if prices go higher? No, the government's going to try to limit the price, and then nobody will bring any new oil on stream.
They'll end up just driving the price higher anyway.
Are you going to get your oil from the government? The same guys who run the post office, the same guys who run Amtrak? I don't think you're going to get much oil from that government or any other government. I'm not picking on our government. Many countries have tried, when prices get in short, when things get in short supply, they just say, well, we're going to limit the price. Well, that makes it worse.
Well, frankly, we live in a country where I think the people who don't particularly pay attention all sort of believe that it's government's job to set prices on things. I saw, in fact, George Bush at Fort Hood during a question and answer where one of the soldiers asked him, Mr. Bush, why don't you lower the price of oil? And, I think that's probably the average American conception of the way things ought to work, right? If the price of oil is getting high, well, the Republicans better do something about it.
Well,
have that strategic reserve or something, right?
Well,
force OPEC's hand.
How are you going to force OPEC's hand? First of all, without going to war with a billion people. Second of all, OPEC doesn't have the oil. That's one reason the price is so high. OPEC doesn't have as much oil as we need. If they did, don't you think they'd be selling oil and driving it down when oil went from $20 to $58? If they had it, don't you think they'd be selling it? Problem is that let me try again. The oil fields in the world are depleting. Alaska production is in decline. It's been going down for 15 years. The Mexican oil fields are in decline. George Bush can stand there all day long and say, send me more oil, Alaska, but they don't have it. George Bush can say to the English all day long, send me more oil, English, but the English don't have it. How's the government going to do it if nobody has the oil? And if you try to limit the price of oil, you think somebody's going to go out and look for oil if you can't sell it at a profit?
I don't know why they would.
Well, of course they're not, and that's what happens whenever governments try to limit, to put controls on something. It always makes it worse. It doesn't make it better. It makes it better for a week, a month, a year sometimes, till the next election. But then in the end, it always has throughout history. This is simple stuff. All you got to do is go back and look. Governments have tried these absurd things over and over and over again, and they always fail.
How do you feel about the central banking? Same thing, you put the Federal Reserve part and parcel with the rest of this?
Well, we've had two previous central banks in the U.S. They both failed because, they were incompetent. In my view, the guy running the central bank in the U.S. right now, Alan Greenspan, is totally incompetent. This central bank will fail, too. If I were the government, I'd abolish the central bank now, abolish the Federal Reserve now before it fails, because they're on the road to total failure. They're running it so badly. And they're not doing any of us any good. They're just making things worse.
Do you object to fiat money itself or just a government monopoly on it?
Well, I object to it's the same thing. Fiat money is.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking like after Andrew Jackson destroyed the central bank, there was a period of kind of wildcatting where the banks were allowed to create money out of nothing, but they were just private. There was no government monopoly on creating money out of nothing, basically.
Right. No, yes, anybody could issue money, but you didn't have to use it. Just because the Bank of Tennessee issued money didn't mean that people had to use it. They wouldn't use it unless they thought it was sound. You wouldn't take the money from the Bank of Tennessee if you didn't think it was good money. And so what has always happened is the sound money comes out on top, and the shysters always lose out at the moment. And that's what happened with the government. The government had to make it a monopoly because nobody trusted the government money anymore than they trusted anybody else's. In England, as recently as 80 years ago, you could use any kind of currency, but when the government said, well, we're going to declare a monopoly, there was so much objection that they had to make it an act of treason to use anything except the government money as money.
And when was that?
In the 30s, the 1930s.
Wow.
The UK Parliament made it an act of treason. It was that important because nobody wanted to use the government money. They always wanted to use other things, whatever they wanted.
So you wouldn't necessarily be for a government-mandated gold standard. You just would have the government get out of the money business altogether?
Yeah, let the world decide. Who's the government to decide which is the best money? The gold standard has worked a few times in history, but it's also failed several times. It's failed in the West a couple of times in the last couple of 100 years. I wouldn't trust the gold standard any more than anything else. Let us all decide what to use as money.
Just have a basic commodity standard as determined by free markets and individuals.
It doesn't have to be commodity standards, Scott. Whatever people want to use. If we want to use paper money, let's use paper money. But why can't I use the euro to go down to the grocery store if I think it's a better currency than the U.S. dollar? Why can't I use the money issued by the Bank of Canada if I think it's better than the U.S. dollar? I mean, who is the U.S. government to tell us that we have to use their money? And again, these monopolies did not exist 150 years ago or even 100 years ago.
Well, you're obviously a free trader, but I wonder what you think of the World Trade Organization, NAFTA, and the
World Trade Organization should also be abolished. I mean, well, first, the World Bank. Sorry, I thought you were asking about the World Bank.
Well, the whole kit and caboodle of them all.
Well, the World
really.
Bank should be abolished, but the World Trade Organization at least is trying to open up borders and trade. Since 1945, in 1945, after the war, everybody said we're not going to let protectionism ruin the world again because in the 20s and 30s, people tried protectionism. It led to total economic collapse. It led to the huge World War II. And everybody in 1945 said, we're not going to let that happen again. And so they started the World Trade Organization. It was called GATT in those days, to open up borders and trade. Well, the world has boomed. We have never had a period in history like we had for those 50 years as more and more world trade took place, as borders opened up, as people could trade with each other. You see how prosperity around the world has boomed. So, of course, I'm in favor of free trade. It's always been for the betterment. It may not be the best system, but it's better than the second best, which has never worked.
Well, but isn't the World Trade Organization more than, I mean, I understand that they regulate in favor of freer trade often, but in the end, is the World Trade Organization not really a form of world government with the power to regulate international trade? I mean, the fact that they happen to regulate toward a freer economy doesn't necessarily really negate the fact that the WTO as it exists is basically a government, right?
You've been reading too much propaganda from somebody, Scott. No, they wish they could do that.
I mean, they decide on trade rules.
Any bureaucracy would love to have more power, and I guess that one would too. But their mandate basically is to open up trading, not to close it off. Whenever somebody tries to close off trade, the World Trade Organization tries to force them to open it up. I mean, it doesn't matter who it is, whether it's the Brazilians or the Europeans or the Americans. If somebody tries to close off, that's why the World Trade Organization is there. It's a place to go and say, wait a minute, they're not acting fairly in world trade.
But if our Congress is doing the wrong thing, and the WTO can overrule our Congress, I mean, that's basically acting as a world state, is it not? That sounds like federalism to me.
But you just got through saying if our Congress is doing the wrong thing, well, who's going to make them right it?
Well, I would have the American people in their local congressional districts make them right it, rather than going to the boss's boss, who usually never sees it my way.
Well, that's good luck if it's going to work that way. It usually takes too long, which is why that's what happened in the 30s. As I said, it led to total economic collapse in the world. Unfortunately, most people who were alive in 1945 and knew the problems, knew what had happened, are no longer alive. I mean, you weren't born in 1945, much less read about it. So therein lies the problem.
Well, no, actually, I've read all about it, and I do understand that. In fact, I just interviewed a guy from Cato who wrote a great book called Wilson's War, and he talks in the beginning all about how throughout the 19th century there was a lot in Europe, there was a lot of opening of trade, but at the same time there was a lot of trade war as well, and how the alliances that developed during the trade wars became the alliances of World War I.
That's right. That's why we have wars, because the trade wars break out. As I said before, nobody ever wins them. They nearly always have led to real war. And nobody wins real wars either. Even though, look, we won the Second World War. Well, Germany and Japan has prospered mightily.
Well,
from having lost that war.
Do you know of a libertarian economist
the World Trade Organization?
All
they can do is, excuse me, you asked me a question. You want my answer?
I'm sorry.
All the World Trade Organization can do is, if Congress does something wrong, then the people who are affected badly can take case to the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization can find, okay, yes, you, America, are in the wrong. And then other countries can retaliate legally. That's all they can do. The World Trade Organization doesn't have an army. You think they're going to send tanks to Chicago? The World Trade Organization doesn't have any tanks.
But it does sanction retaliation and therefore kind of perpetuate it, right?
No, it tries to open it up. And normally what happens is when the World Trade Organization finds somebody in violation, everybody says, even the violators then say, well, okay, we were in the wrong and we'll rectify it. That's normally what has happened, not always, and the ones that don't try to go along usually suffer in the end. Protectionism has never worked. I mean, don't take my word for it, Scott. Go back and look at the history books.
Well, I agree with you. Really, what I'm trying to get at is, I'm not sure if you're familiar with a libertarian economist named Tibor Machan.
Sure, he stayed in my house.
Oh, well, there you go. Well, Tibor Machan told me that, hey, if you want to have a free trade agreement, it should be one sentence long. And it should say, hey, there will be free trade between people in this country and people in that one. And that to create the World Trade Organization is basically working the wrong direction in the name of the right thing, in the name of freer trade. And, in fact, I mean, as you described, it has opened up trade tremendously. At the same time, though, it's basically creating centralized power further and further away from regular folks.
Tibor is exactly right. That's all you need. It's just as there's going to be free trade. But suppose people then violate that. What do? Say, oh, well, too bad for the world. That's the only reason. If the world has that one-sentence free trade agreement, and then let's say Afghanistan violates it, what do? And then when Afghanistan violates it, then the next thing you know, Uruguay says, well, if Afghanistan got away with it, we'll do it too. And the next thing you know, Ethiopia says, well, we'll do it too. So, yeah, it's wonderful to have that one sentence, and I would agree with Tibor 100%. You don't need any of this until people start violating, and then what happens? Then you have the 30s, and then you have the trade wars, and then you have the financial collapse, and then you have the Second World War or the First World War.
Well, I think some of the, and I admit I'm more of a politics guy than an economist, but I think most of them would say you do nothing. If they don't honor their trade agreement, you just do nothing because you're still going to benefit anyway, and that fighting back only makes matters worse. But anyway, I think we're pretty much of the same mind on there, just coming from different directions. It's the Weekend Interview Show. I'm talking with Jim Rogers. We'll be right back.
Things don't seem to be as easy as they used to be. It's getting harder every day. The things got better things to say about what's going on around you and what's happening inside you. When it's time to change, you won't know how. It's 1 years from now. Tell me what you think or do or say. Everything's the same.
All right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton, and I am a firm believer in free markets. I think that everyone, basically, if put in charge of everyone else, is going to be an idiot, and everything they do is going to be wrong. But when people are left to their own devices to make their own decisions and make their own predictions and put their money where they think it ought to go, you're going to end up with the best solution. In fact, people may remember after September 11th, they proposed making a terrorism stock market, basically, where people would put money on predicting terrorist attacks. And I thought it was a great idea. I mean, it's sort of cold to think of people making money off of some terrorism going on like that, but it probably would be the best way to predict terrorism. And since I'm talking with Jim Rogers, who is a capitalist, the adventure capitalist, in fact, who travels all around the world having adventures and looking for investment opportunities, I think he's probably got his finger really on the pulse of what's going on, particularly in Asia. And one of my major concerns is the growing conflict between America and Russia and China. And I basically wonder just what insights you have, sir, about what do you think, economics aside, basically, the relations between the governments of America, Russia, and China have in store for us in the next few years?
Russia is a disaster which is going to spiral down into a catastrophe. The Soviet Union is broken up into 15 countries. It's going to be, 50 countries before it's over 100 countries. That's just an ongoing disaster. We don't have to worry about Russia or any of the previous Soviet states. I assure you, they're just going to continue to disintegrate. So I don't care what our relationship is there. They're no threat to us and will not be in our lifetime. China, on the other hand, is going to be the next great country in the world. As I told you before, I'm teaching my 23-month-old daughter Chinese. The best advice I can give people is to teach your children and grandchildren Chinese, because it's going to be the most important language, certainly second language in the world in their lifetime. China's on the rise, whether we like it or not. There's no reason for us to fear it. In fact, it could be good for us, and we could be good for them. Unfortunately, Scott, throughout history, when you've had a mature country that's been dominant, that's sort of peaking, and then there's another country on the rise, well, they've always sort of run into each other somewhere along the way. I don't like that, but that's the way the world has always worked. It doesn't have to work that way, but it unfortunately always has. You know who the mature economy and society is in the world right now, and you know who's on the rise. Mm-hmm. At least I think I do, and it's certainly not Russia.
What do you think about Iran? It's rumored in all different places to what degree we're going to invade that country and change their regime. What do you predict there?
Well, if we do, it's going to be the end of the U.S. because we're already overextended militarily. Scott, I mean, I don't know who we're going to, when we have to rotate the troops in Iraq next, who's going to go. They don't have anybody else. They can't get recruits. The equipment is running out. Bullets are running out. There's no way we can. Iran has got 70 million people and it's full of mountains. Iraq was 25 million people and it's flat as a pancake.
Are you worried about, and I'm sorry we only have about 1 minute left here, a little bit less actually, but does the $9 trillion debt worry you, sir?
It worries me horribly. My baby girl has a bank account, Scott, but she doesn't have an American bank account. She's got a foreign bank account.
All right.
She knows they're debasing our currency.
All right. Thank you. JimRogers.com, everybody, is the website. Jim Rogers is the author of Investment Biker, Adventure Capitalist, and Hot Commodities. He's got a great article up on LouRockwell.com last week called The Rise of Red Capitalism. Thank you very much for your time today, sir.
Thank you. See you next time.
All right. Take care. All right, everybody. We'll be right back with some news and then Lawrence Vance about the fraud sales tax they're proposing.